Every Christmas, this town read a list. If your name wasn't on it, nothing happened right away. But your life began to disappear. North Wycliffe looked beautiful in December. That was the problem. Stone houses were draped with soft white lights. Wreaths hung on doors older than most countries. Snow fell just enough to forgive everything beneath it. People liked to say the town hadn't changed in centuries. That was only half true. What hadn't changed was what the town expected from you. At 10:58 p.m., the church bells rang once. Not to announce anything. Just to remind people where they were supposed to be. By 11:10, the pews were full. Families sat together in careful arrangements that reflected more than affection. Position mattered. Absence mattered more. Oliver Grant sat in the third row on the left, between his mother and an empty space that no one mentioned. He hadn't sat there since he was 19. Back then, he believed leaving was an act of courage. Now, returning felt like a test he hadn't studied for. "Your father would have liked this," his mother whispered. Oliver nodded. He did not trust his voice. The church smelled of pine, wax, and something colder, stone that remembered winters better than people did. The choir stood. The first hymn began. Everyone sang. Everyone except Oliver. He mouthed the words he'd learned as a child, careful not to be too loud. Careful not to be noticed. North Wycliffe called it the good names list. No one ever said who wrote it. People said it was kept. As if lists were living things that survived on their own. Every Christmas Eve, at exactly 11:47 p.m., the list was read aloud from the pulpit. Names only. No explanations. No commentary. Just confirmation. At 11:45, the murmuring stopped. At 11:46, even children went quiet. Oliver felt his heart slow, then pick up again, like it was adjusting to the rules of the room. The vicar stepped forward. He did not smile. He never smiled for this part. Tonight, the vicar said calmly, "We give thanks for those among us who have lived this year with care, commitment, and respect for our shared values." Oliver felt his mother's hand tighten around his. He did not look at her. He looked straight ahead, at the carved wooden cross he'd stared at as a child whenever he felt judged. It had never helped then either. The first name was read. Then another. Oliver recognized most of them. Some were expected. Some were strategic. Applause was not allowed. But people breathed differently when a familiar name was spoken. Relief had a sound. His father's name was read. His mother exhaled. His sister's name followed. Someone behind him shifted. The space beside Oliver remained empty. The list continued. Oliver counted without meaning to. 10 names. 20. 30. He felt something settle in his chest, not fear yet, but preparation. Like the moment before a verdict when you already know how it ends. The vicar paused. Not long. Just long enough. Then he folded the paper. "That concludes the list for this year," he said. The bells began. 11:47. Oliver did not move. He didn't need to look around to know. No one was looking at him directly. That was worse. People avoided him with a skill learned early. As if exclusion were contagious. After the service, the church filled with polite motion. Coats were put on. Hands were shaken. Voices stayed warm but distant. People said, "Merry Christmas." "Lovely service." "Cold this year." No one said Oliver's name. Outside, snow crunched softly underfoot. The town square glowed with lights and music. Someone laughed too loudly. Oliver stood near the steps of the church, unsure where to go. His mother kissed his cheek. "We'll talk later," she said quietly. Not "it's all right." Not "I'm sorry." Just later. The next morning, Oliver woke up early. Not from anxiety. From clarity. He knew exactly how the day would go. That frightened him more than hope ever had. At 9:12 a.m., he received an email from work. Restructuring, it said. Nothing personal. At 11:30, his girlfriend packed a bag. I can't stay here, she said. Not now. At 2 p.m., he ran into a former teacher who smiled sadly. Maybe, she said gently, this town is trying to tell you something. Oliver nodded. He was tired of arguing. By evening, the bells rang again. Not for ceremony. Just habit. Oliver walked toward the old bridge at the edge of town. Snow gathered quietly on the railing. The river below moved steadily, unconcerned. Oliver stood there for a long time. Long enough to hear the town behind him resume its comfort. Long enough to understand the final lesson. Belonging here was conditional. And conditions could be withdrawn. When they found him, the report would say, no foul play. No signs of struggle. No note. A tragedy. An unfortunate young man who couldn't cope. North Wycliffe would mourn briefly. Then move on. The list, after all, had been read. 3 days later, Edward Hale arrived in town. Christmas lights were still up. Snow still covered the stones. Everything looked perfect. Edward felt the unease immediately. Not because someone had died, but because the town already knew how to explain it. Edward Hale arrived in North Wycliffe on the morning of December 27th. Christmas was technically over. The decorations hadn't been taken down yet, not out of laziness, but out of principle. In North Wycliffe, things were removed only when everyone agreed they should be. Edward parked near the square and stayed in the car longer than necessary. The town looked finished. Not abandoned. Completed. Like a puzzle that no longer wanted to be rearranged. That unsettled him. The first thing Edward noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound. There were footsteps, distant conversation, the hum of a generator near the market stalls, but the absence of contradiction. Everything seemed to agree with everything else. Edward stepped out of the car and felt eyes adjust to his presence. Not stare. Assess. He had learned long ago to recognize that look. It wasn't suspicion. It was classification. The police station was small and impeccably tidy. Inspector Harold Finch stood when Edward entered, already holding out his hand. Mr. Hale, Finch said. Thank you for coming. Finch was in his late 50s, with a careful manner and a voice trained to sound reassuring without making promises. You didn't specify a crime, Edward said as they shook hands. Finch smiled thinly. We don't usually, he replied. Edward raised an eyebrow. That's not comforting, he said. Finch gestured toward his office. It's practical, he replied. They Saturday. Files were laid out neatly. Photographs. Statements. A death certificate. Oliver Grant's face looked younger in print. Officially, Finch said, this is an accident. No indication of foul play. Edward nodded. Unofficially, he asked. Finch hesitated. Unofficially, he said, it happens. Edward looked up. People die, he asked. People fall, Finch replied. After Christmas. Edward let that sit. Edward flipped through the statements. Same phrases appeared repeatedly. He was struggling. He didn't quite fit anymore. The town can be difficult. Edward closed the folder. Difficult how? He asked. Finch leaned back. Expectant, he said. Edward nodded slowly. That's usually worse, he said. Edward's next stop was Oliver Grant's former workplace, a small architectural firm occupying the upper floor of a converted mill. The office smelled of coffee and stale ambition. Oliver's manager, Simon Fletcher, greeted Edward politely. We liked Oliver, Fletcher said. Talented. Smart. Edward waited. But? Edward prompted. Fletcher exhaled. But he kept questioning things, he said. Processes. Traditions. Edward nodded. Innovation, he asked. Fletcher shook his head. Direction, he said. Around here, direction is inherited. Edward made a note. At a cafe near the square, Edward ordered tea and listened. The town talked softly. Not about Oliver. About weather. About visitors. About how busy it had been. A woman at the next table said, "Well, his name wasn't read." No one asked which name. Edward visited Oliver's mother in the early afternoon. Margaret Grant lived in a narrow stone house near the church. She offered Edward tea and did not ask why he was there. "I suppose you want to know about the list," she said quietly. Edward nodded. "Yes," he said. "But not first." Margaret looked at him carefully. "Then you're different," she said. Margaret described Oliver as restless. "He wanted to be optional," she said. "Not defined." Edward frowned slightly. "That's not usually how parents describe their children," he said. Margaret smiled sadly. "It is here," she replied. Edward asked about the Christmas service. Margaret's hands tightened around her cup. "When his name wasn't read," she said, "I knew what would happen." Edward's voice was gentle. "And you let him leave?" he asked. Margaret looked at him sharply. "No," she said. "The town did." Edward walked to the church alone. The doors were open. Inside, volunteers were already preparing for the next event, a New Year's concert. Edward sat in a pew halfway back. The building felt practiced. Every echo knew where to land. Edward imagined the list being read. Names falling into silence like approvals. He felt a familiar anger rise, quiet, controlled. Not at belief. At coordination. In the late afternoon, Edward was invited, not formally, to tea at the home of Arthur Bell, the church's senior warden. Bell's house overlooked the square. He had chosen that location decades ago. "We care about our people," Bell said warmly, pouring tea. "That's what outsiders misunderstand." Edward accepted the cup but did not drink. "You decide who counts as your people," Edward said. Bell smiled. "Belonging isn't automatic," he replied. "It has to be maintained." Edward met his gaze. "At what cost?" he asked. Bell's smile never wavered. "Discomfort," he said. "Occasionally." Edward asked directly. "Who writes the list?" he said. Bell shook his head. "No one," he said. "It's agreed upon." Edward let out a quiet breath. "That's worse," he said. Bell looked amused. "Consensus is stability," he replied. Edward stood. "Consensus without dissent is choreography," he said. Bell did not argue. As night fell, Edward walked through the square again. Lights glowed. Children laughed. Nothing looked wrong. Edward thought of Oliver standing in the same place days earlier. Invisible. Edward stopped near the Christmas tree. A girl tugged on her mother's coat. "Mummy," she asked, "why didn't they read everyone's name?" The mother hesitated. "That's not how it works," she said. The girl frowned. "Why not?" she asked. The mother glanced at Edward, just briefly, then away. "Because," she said, "some people don't belong anymore." Edward felt something tighten in his chest. Back at his hotel room, Edward wrote 3 words in his notebook. Tradition enforces silence. He underlined them. Then added a 4th. Collectively. Edward closed the notebook and looked out the window at the church tower. The bells were quiet now. The bells were quiet now. But Edward knew the town was already preparing the next list. And someone else's name. Edward Hale woke before the town did. North Wycliffe was quiet in the early morning, not because nothing was happening, but because everything important happened behind closed doors. The streets were clean, the lights still on, the Christmas decorations still insisting on joy like a rule. Edward stood at his hotel window and watched a man sweep snow from the steps of the church with slow, methodical care. Not because the snow was heavy. Because the ritual mattered. Edward wrote one sentence in his notebook before he left the room. If a town needs a list to stay peaceful, it isn't peaceful. At 8:40 a.m., Inspector Harold Finch met him at the station. "You're up early," Finch observed. "I don't sleep well in places that agree too much," Edward replied. Finch gave a cautious smile. "You'll find we disagree plenty," he said. Edward looked at him. "Privately," he said. "Not publicly." Finch did not deny it. Edward's first request was simple. "I want the lists," he said. Finch blinked. The good names list," Edward said. "Every year you have it. Someone keeps it. I want to see the last 20. Finch's expression tightened. "We don't keep them at the station," he said. Edward waited. Finch sighed. "The church has records," he admitted. "But it's not public." Edward nodded. "It isn't meant to be," he said. "That's why it works." The church records office was colder than the main sanctuary. Stone walls, metal shelves, papers stored like they were more valuable than people. Arthur Bell was there again, already waiting, as if he'd expected Edward to arrive at this exact hour. "Mr. Hale," Bell said pleasantly. "Inspector." Finch nodded stiffly. Bell smiled at Edward. "You want the lists," Bell said. Edward didn't bother denying it. "Yes," he replied. Bell folded his hands. "I can show you what is appropriate," he said. Edward leaned in slightly. "And I can read what isn't," he replied. Bell's smile stayed polite. "You're direct," he noted. "I'm efficient," Edward said. "Your tradition isn't." Bell turned and walked between the shelves. "We don't see it as tradition," he said. "We see it as gratitude." Edward followed. "You read names," Edward said. "That's not gratitude. That's classification." Bell stopped. "You say that like it's wrong," he replied. Edward didn't answer. He let the silence do what it always did, invite the other person to fill it. Bell did. "Communities need boundaries," Bell said quietly. Edward nodded. "So do prisons," he replied. Finch's jaw tightened. "Edward," he warned softly. Edward didn't look at him. Bell handed over a binder. Inside, year after year, identical paper, identical format, identical restraint. Names. Nothing else. Edward turned pages slowly. 2011. 2012. 2013. The same families appeared again and again. The same surnames like stamped approval. Edward's eyes narrowed. "What about the names that don't appear?" he asked. Bell's tone remained calm. "Some people leave," he said. "Some people adrift." Edward looked up. "And some people are removed," he said. Bell's smile flickered. "No one is removed," he said. "That implies punishment." Edward tapped the binder. "What do you call it when everyone stops saying your name?" Edward asked. Bell's voice softened. "Consequence," he said. "Of choices." Edward's gaze sharpened. "Whose choices?" he asked. Bell didn't answer. That was an answer. Edward copied the lists, by hand. Not because he enjoyed it. Because writing forced pattern recognition into the body. He wrote names for nearly an hour while Finch paced impatiently. When Edward finished, he closed his notebook and said, "I need the missing years." Bell frowned. "The missing? These lists are too clean," Edward said. "No corrections. No amendments. No messy human error." Bell's smile returned. "We are careful," he said. Edward nodded. And you've removed the years that would show how you became careful, he replied. Finch stared at Edward. Belle's eyes cooled slightly. You're suggesting we're hiding history, Belle said. Edward's voice stayed level. I'm suggesting you curated it, he replied. There's a difference. Belle held the gaze. Then, with a polite motion, he opened a drawer and pulled out a thinner folder. These are older, he said. The format changed. Edward took it. Inside were lists from the early 2000s, less polished, occasional handwritten editions. And names that appeared once, then never again. Edward felt the first true click of the case. Not evidence of murder. Evidence of method. He left the church with Finch and walked into the square. You're going to tell me the town is killing people, Finch said, already defensive. Edward shook his head. No, he said. The town is removing safety nets. Finch frowned. That's not a crime, he said. Edward looked at him. It is when the removal is coordinated, he said. Finch's eyes narrowed. You can't prove coordination, he replied. Edward nodded. Not with one death, he said. But with a pattern. Edward's next stop was the school. Not because Oliver had studied there. Because schools were where towns taught their rules. The head teacher, Dr. Elaine Porter, greeted Edward with the kind of smile that belonged on official letters. Mr. Hale, she said, hand extended. I'm told you're here about a tragedy. I'm here about a mechanism, Edward replied. Porter blinked. That's an unusual way to put it. It's accurate, Edward said. Porter invited him into her office. Certificates lined the walls. Awards for community engagement. Edward sat and glanced at a framed photo of the Christmas service. Every year, he asked. Porter nodded. It brings the town together, she said. By naming some people, Edward replied. Porter's smile tightened. You misunderstand, she said. It's not exclusion. It's recognition. Edward leaned forward. Recognition is neutral, he said. This isn't neutral. Porter's tone cooled by a degree. What exactly are you implying? She asked. Edward looked her in the eye. That the list is used as leverage, he said. Porter let out a small laugh. Leverage, she repeated. Over what? People's feelings. Edward nodded. Over their lives, he replied. Porter's eyes hardened. You don't know this town, she said. Edward's voice stayed calm. I know towns, he said. This one just pretends it's a choir. He asked for student records. Porter refused. He expected that. Instead, he asked a different question. In the last 10 years, Edward said, how many students left town and never came back? Porter hesitated. Some leave, she said. It's normal. How many returned? Edward asked. Porter's jaw tightened. That isn't your concern, she said. Edward nodded. It is if the town treats leaving as betrayal, he replied. Porter ended the meeting politely. Edward walked out knowing he had found one of the hands that held the list. Outside the school, he met Grace Holloway, Oliver's former teacher, the one who had spoken to him before he died. She looked older than her years, the way some people did when they carried too much responsibility for other people's children. You shouldn't be here, Grace said quietly. Edward studied her. Because it's dangerous, he asked. Grace shook her head. Because it won't change anything, she replied. Edward's voice was gentle. People say that when they want it not to change, he said. Grace looked away. I tried, she said. Edward waited. Grace continued. I told them years ago it was cruel, she said. That it was social violence. Edward nodded once. And what did they say? He asked. Grace's mouth tightened. They said it was kindness, she replied. Because it encouraged people to do better. Edward's eyes narrowed. Encouraged, he repeated. Grace laughed once, bitterly. It encourages obedience, she said. It encourages obedience, she said. Edward looked at her. And Oliver, he asked. Grace's expression softened. He thought he could leave and come back without paying, she said quietly. He didn't know the price had gone up. Edward wrote the sentence down. Who decides the price? He asked. Grace met his gaze. You already know, she said. The ones who never leave. Edward asked Grace for names. Not of the good. Of the disappeared. Grace hesitated. Then, with a look that suggested she was crossing an internal line, she handed him a small notebook. Don't copy this, she said. Edward took it carefully. I won't need to, he replied. I'll remember the pattern. Inside, names. Dates. Small notes. Moved away after list. Lost job. Left town. Family stopped speaking. Died in March. Accident. Edward's chest tightened. This wasn't superstition. It was logistics. That evening, Finch drove Edward to the archives room at the town hall. Michael Reeves, nowhere near North Wycliffe, but the same type of man existed here too. In North Wycliffe, his name was Councillor Martin Crowe. Crowe greeted them with warm authority. Inspector, Crowe said. Mr. Hale. Edward nodded. You're here about Oliver Grant, Crowe said smoothly. I'm here about your list, Edward replied. Crowe's smile didn't break. Ah, he said. That. Edward watched him carefully. Crowe didn't fear the accusation. He feared the wording. Why do you read it? Edward asked. Crowe gestured toward a cabinet of files. Because towns need cohesion, he said. People need to know what's expected. Edward's voice was even. People already know, he said. They're terrified of being reminded publicly. Crowe smiled. Terror is your interpretation, he said. I'd say, a motivation. Edward leaned in. Motivation works when people can refuse, he said. Can they? Crowe's smile thinned slightly. They can leave, he replied. Edward nodded. And you make sure leaving costs them everything, he said. Crowe's eye sharpened. You're accusing us of coercion, he said. Edward replied calmly. I'm describing your business model, he said. Edward requested access to town records, employment disputes, property claims, council resolutions. Crowe allowed it, confident. Perhaps too confident. Edward spent hours scanning minutes of meetings, noting one recurring phrase. In keeping with established community values. Always the same. Always vague. Always used to justify decisions that harmed someone who didn't fit. Edward underlined it repeatedly. Values, he murmured. Undefined. Unchallengeable. Perfect. At 9:38 p.m., as Edward was preparing to leave, Finch returned with a new report. Another incident. Not a death. Not yet. A woman had been found sitting on the steps of the church in the snow, staring at the doors. Her name was Rachel Sykes. She was 32. Married. Local. She kept repeating one sentence. They won't say my name. Finch looked tired. We thought she was drunk, he said. She wasn't. Edward stood. Take me to her, he said. Rachel Sykes sat on the church steps like someone waiting for judgment. Her husband stood beside her, pale, helpless, too polite to look angry in public. Edward crouched near her, keeping his voice low. Rachel, he said. Who won't say your name? Rachel looked up slowly. Her eyes were clear. Too clear. The town, she whispered. They've started. Edward felt the hair at the back of his neck tighten. Started what? He asked. Rachel swallowed. They've stopped inviting us, she said. Stopped answering. Stopped making eye contact. Edward glanced at Finch. This was the mechanism in its early stage. Not punishment. Preparation. Edward looked back at Rachel. Why? He asked. Rachel's lips trembled. Because my husband applied for work in Leeds, she said. We haven't even gone. We just considered it. Edward's voice remained calm. And someone found out, he said. Rachel nodded. Edward stood and looked up at the church. Edward stood and looked up at the church. The building was silent. But the town was speaking loudly through absence. Finch exhaled. This isn't evidence, he said. It's social behavior. Edward looked at him. Social behavior becomes a weapon when it's coordinated, Edward said. Finch rubbed his face. And what am I supposed to do? Finch asked. Edward's gaze was steady. Find who benefits, he replied. And who controls access? Finch frowned. Access to what? Edward gestured toward the church doors. Belonging, he said. Back at the station, Edward laid out the case in a way Finch could understand. Not philosophy. Process. They don't kill, Edward said. Not directly. Finch stared. Then why are we here? He asked. Edward tapped the file. Because Oliver died after being removed from the town's protection, he said. His job, his relationships, his social support, gone within days. Finch frowned. That could be coincidence, he said. Edward nodded. It could, he said. If it happened once. He opened Grace Holloway's notebook. It didn't, he said. Finch's face tightened. Where did you get that? He asked. Edward ignored the question. Look at the dates, he said. Always after Christmas. Always after the list. Always with the same steps: silence, exclusion, collapse. Finch stared at the pattern. This is, he began. A system, Edward finished. Finch swallowed. And who runs it? He asked. Edward looked toward the dark window where the church tower rose above the town like a finger held to someone's lips. The ones who can read names into reality, Edward said. And erase them just as quietly. Edward's phone buzzed at 11:32 p.m. A message. Unknown number. You shouldn't interfere with traditions. They protect us. Edward stared at the screen. Finch leaned in. Who sent that? Finch asked. Edward's voice was flat. Someone who believes fear is protection, he said. Finch's eyes narrowed. They're watching you, he said. Edward nodded. They were watching Oliver too, he replied. He typed a single response. Who writes the list? The reply came quickly. Everyone does. Edward smiled faintly. Of course, he murmured. That was the most dangerous answer possible. Because it meant no one would feel responsible. Edward closed his notebook. Finch watched him. What now? Finch asked. Edward's gaze was steady. Now, he said, we stop treating this like folklore. He stood. We treat it like organized coercion, he said. With a schedule. Finch frowned. A schedule, he repeated. Edward nodded. They read it every Christmas, he said. And they're already preparing the next one. Finch's face tightened. You think there will be another name, he said. Edward's voice stayed calm. There always is, he replied. Edward Hale understood one thing very clearly. North Wycliffe did not need secrecy to function. It needed participation. That was why the list was powerful. Not because it was hidden, but because everyone agreed not to question it. The committee never met in secret. That was its greatest strength. They met openly, predictably, always under the guise of something harmless: planning, coordination, tradition. Edward was invited to observe. That invitation alone told him everything. The meeting took place in the upper room of the town hall. A long oak table. 6 chairs. 5 already occupied. Arthur Bell, the church warden. Elaine Porter, head teacher. Martin Crowe, counselor. Simon Fletcher, business owner. And Margaret Doyle, chair of the festival committee. 5 pillars. No robes. No conspiracy whispers. Just people who had never had to defend their authority. Edward took the empty chair. "You asked to attend," Bell said mildly. Edward nodded. "Yes," he said. "You didn't refuse." Bell smiled. "Transparency," he said. "You've already accused us of lacking it." Edward met his gaze. "You confuse transparency with confidence," Edward said. "They're not the same." No one laughed. Crowe spoke next. "You believe the list causes harm," he said calmly. Edward leaned back. "I believe the list enables harm," he replied. "And then absolves you of it." Porter frowned. "That's unfair," she said. "We don't punish anyone." Edward turned to her. "No," he said. "You withdraw support." Fletcher scoffed. "Support is earned," he said. Edward nodded. "That's the sentence," he replied. "You just don't hear it anymore." Margaret Doyle cleared her throat. "You're not from here," she said. "You don't understand what keeps this town intact." Edward looked at her. "What happens if you stop reading the list?" he asked. A pause. "Not long." "Too long." Bell answered. "People would lose direction," he said. Edward's voice was steady. "No," he said. "You would." Edward placed his notebook on the table. "I want to know how this year's list was decided," he said. Crowe raised an eyebrow. "This year's list hasn't been finalized," he said. Edward smiled faintly. "That's a lie," he replied. The room chilled by a degree. Edward continued. "You start narrowing names in October," he said. "By November, the omissions are clear. By December, the reading is a formality." He looked at Bell. "You even rehearse the pacing," Edward said. "So the pauses land where they should." Bell didn't deny it. "That's respect," Bell said. Edward shook his head. "No," he said. "That's theater." Porter leaned forward. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Do you enjoy dismantling things?" Edward met her gaze. "No," he said. "I enjoy preventing predictable deaths." Silence. Fletcher scoffed. "Deaths," he said. "One boy makes a bad choice and suddenly we're murderers." Edward's eye sharpened. "He didn't make a bad choice," Edward said. "He was systematically stripped of alternatives." Crowe interjected calmly. "He could have stayed," he said. Edward replied instantly. "He was already gone," he said. "You'd removed him before he stepped onto that bridge." Bell folded his hands. "What do you want?" he asked. Edward answered without hesitation. "This year's list," he said. Margaret Doyle laughed quietly. "That will never happen," she said. Edward nodded. "I know," he said. "So I took the liberty of preparing another one." The room froze. Edward stood. He removed a folded sheet of paper from his coat. "This is a list too," he said. "It just follows a different logic." Crowe's voice hardened. "You have no authority," he said. Edward looked at him. "Authority only exists because people keep recognizing it," Edward said. "And recognition can be redirected." Bell stood abruptly. "You will not disrupt the service," he said. Edward's tone was calm. "I won't," he said. "I'll participate." Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in snow and certainty. The church was fuller than ever. Word had spread, not of danger, but of tension. People felt something was coming. They did not know what. Edward sat near the aisle, 3 rows back. Rachel Sykes sat with her husband, pale but present. The committee occupied the front pew. Bell stood at the pulpit. The bells rang. 11:47. Bell began reading. Names fell into the room like coins into a bowl. Some people relaxed visibly. Others leaned forward, counting. Edward watched the faces, not the list. Fear did not look dramatic. It looked attentive. Bell reached the final name. Folded the paper. "This concludes." Edward stood. The sound of movement cut through the room like glass breaking. Bell froze. Edward's voice carried without effort. "Before we close," Edward said, "I would like to read another list." Gasps. Murmurs. Porter whispered urgently. Crow half stood. Bell raised a hand. "This is highly inappropriate," he said. Edward nodded. "So is what you've been doing for decades," he replied. Edward began to read. Not loudly. Carefully. Names that had never appeared before. Names of people who had left. Names of people who'd been ignored. Names of people who had been quietly erased. Each name landed differently. Not relief. Recognition. A woman began to cry. Not loudly. Honestly. A man whispered, "That's my brother." Someone else stood. "That's my daughter," they said. The room shifted. Not chaos. Awareness. Bell's voice shook. "Stop," he said. Edward continued. "I'm not done," he said. "You never are." When Edward finished, the church was silent. No bells. No choir. No authority left to cue the ending. A child spoke from the back. Why didn't they read those names before? No one answered. Bell stepped back from the pulpit. Crow sat down heavily. Porter stared at the floor. The list, the real one, lay useless on the lectern. The aftermath was not dramatic. It was administrative. Resignations. Reviews. Meetings that lasted too long. Some people defended the tradition. Others refused to participate again. North Wycliffe did not heal. But it fractured. And fractures let air in. Edward left town on December 26th. As he drove away, the church bells rang. Not on schedule. Not in unison. Someone had pulled the rope without permission. Edward smiled faintly. That sound meant the town no longer agreed on when to be silent. North Wycliffe did not fall apart. That disappointed some people. Others had secretly hoped it would, because collapse would have been easier to explain than change. But the town remained standing. Stone houses stayed where they were. The church still dominated the square. The Christmas lights were taken down on schedule. What changed was quieter. The first change was administrative. Arthur Bell resigned for health reasons. Martin Crowe announced he would not seek re-election. Elaine Porter took early retirement, citing exhaustion. No apologies were issued. No wrongdoing was officially acknowledged. North Wycliffe preferred adjustments to admissions. Edward Hale expected that. Institutions rarely confess. They reorganize. The second change was social. People began saying names again. Not publicly. Not ceremonially. In hesitant greetings. "Did you hear from Rachel? Is Oliver's mother doing all right? I saw Mark last week, he's back." Names returned before trust did. That was normal. Rachel Sykes moved to Leeds in February. Not dramatically. No farewell gathering. Just a quiet departure. Edward received a postcard a month later. "We're sleeping better," it read. It's strange how loud kindness can be when it's voluntary. Edward placed it inside his notebook without comment. Margaret Grant sold her house in spring. She left North Wycliffe after 47 years. Before she went, she met Edward once more, at the cafe near the square. "I keep wondering," she said, staring into her cup, "if I could have stopped him." Edward answered carefully. "You could have broken the silence," he said. "But you didn't create it." Margaret nodded. "That doesn't feel like forgiveness," she said. Edward met her gaze. "It isn't," he replied. "It's accuracy." She smiled faintly. "That's almost worse," she said. Edward didn't disagree. Inspector Harold Finch remained. That surprised Edward. But Finch had learned something valuable: what order costs when it's maintained too carefully. "I hear them differently now," Finch said one evening, as they walked past the church. "People's silences." Edward nodded. "That means you're doing your job," he said. Finch sighed. "It means I'm tired," he replied. Edward smiled. "That too." North Wycliffe cancelled the good names list. Officially. Unofficially, it lingered. Some habits take longer to unlearn than others. People still watched each other. Still measured conformity. Still spoke carefully. But now, when someone asked why, the question stayed in the room. That was new. On Christmas Eve the following year, the church was full again. The service was shorter. No list was read. Just hymns. Just scripture. Just uncertainty about when it would end. Edward was not there. But someone else noticed the silence. A boy whispered to his father, "Aren't they forgetting something?" The father hesitated. Then said, "No. They're remembering something else." Edward Hale spent that Christmas alone. Not because he had no one. Because he chose not to perform comfort. He walked through a city that did not know his name and liked it that way. Snow fell. Lights flickered. People hurried. No one evaluated him. Edward found that restful. Later that night, Edward sat at his desk. He opened his notebook to a blank page. He wrote slowly. "Traditions don't survive because they're true. They survive because they're repeated." He paused. Then added, "And repetition is easier than responsibility." Edward closed the notebook. His phone buzzed. A message. Unknown number. "They're starting something similar here." Not a list. Something else. Edward stared at the screen for a long moment. Then typed, "What do they call it?" The reply came. "A blessing." Edward exhaled slowly. He stood, put on his coat, and reached for his keys. Somewhere, a town was preparing to decide who belonged. Again. Outside, church bells rang in the distance. Not in unison. Not on time. Edward paused, listening. A city where bells disagreed was a city that could still change. He stepped into the cold and walked toward the sound. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more psychological mysteries where nothing supernatural is happening, and that's what makes it disturbing. New detective stories are released regularly. Until next time, pay attention to the words people choose.